Hi, my name is Michael Green. I'm the Program Manager for Guest Configuration, and I'd like to guide you through this document. So the context of this page is all about what is the difference between Windows PowerShell DSC and the new DSC version 3 that's used in guest configuration. I'm going to walk you through each of these sections and just explain exactly what it's saying in case you didn't want to read it end to end. And hopefully this will actually add a little bit more context as well. So guest configuration across the board, Windows and Linux, uses PowerShell core. If you're familiar with DSC in previous versions, DSC on Linux previously used a combination of Python and C language. So starting with DSC version 3, it's PowerShell core. For Windows, it's PowerShell 7.1.3. For Linux, it's PowerShell 7.2 Preview 6 as of the time of this document. And that's actually sideloaded by the agent. That detail is included here in this Understanding Azure Policies Guest Configuration page. But you don't have to worry about preloading PowerShell core on your machine, and you don't have to worry about keeping it up to date. So whenever the agent gets installed, it brings with it an instance of .NET Core and PowerShell, and if it does not add it to system path. So if you were to type pwsh at the command line or in bash, you're not going to launch into that. It's set aside in a folder, and the purpose of this really was to make sure that requirements are there, but also in the event that some major update is required, that gets managed by the extension, and we don't have to ask people to maintain that. Big new feature for DSC, we now support multiple configurations. So in the past, Windows PowerShell pretty much had a single configuration in most cases, and then partial configurations allowed you to manage multiple configurations, or you could use composite resources to nest them. In DSC version 3, we can just independently assign as many configurations as you'd like. I actually don't know if there is even an upper limit. I don't think so. So the idea is if you want to have one configuration across, let's say, your entire subscription that makes sure that some major security issue is closed, but then for a specific resource group, you want to make sure that all your operational requirements are there. And then maybe for a specific machine, you want to assign a configuration that builds a web server. You can do that. You can assign each of those configurations. Keep in mind, there is no conflict detection. So if configuration 1 and configuration 3 are trying to manage the same resource with a different set of properties, they're just going to keep overriding each other. And there's no control over the sort order for when that gets applied. All of this is on our radar and something we're looking at. They're just things to be aware of right now. Configuration mode set in the package artifact. This is actually the beginning of having all of the meta configuration properties that previously, like we set in LCM as the meta config moth file. Since we now support multiple configurations, those properties could be different for each configuration. You might in the future want different schedules or different behaviors. And so you are managing those really through the authoring module and the information that you provided, the commandlets that generate the package. But if you go look inside that zip file, you'll find a JSON document that is the beginning of storing the meta config. And this is work in progress, but the first one that you see there is configuration mode, which right now is audit or audit and set. And that does exactly what it sounds like. It controls if the package will be set to read only if it's only doing audits, or it can apply changes if it's audit and set. And kind of the last thing related to MOFs, we now support parameters coming from ARM flowing into the MOF. So the way that works is whenever you create the guest assignment, and there's more information about that in this next article, Understanding Guest Assignments. When that guest assignment is created, you can store a property bag that says, here's a list of things in the MOF file that I want to overwrite when it's downloaded to the machine. So a good example might be you've created a configuration that's going to handle which version of TLS is used by IIS, something like that. And you default to 1.1, but then you've got one application that requires 1.2. You can actually define that in the parameters of the guest assignment. And the way that looks is it's like resource ID, resource name, semicolon property. So imagine it was registry key. It's going to be like square bracket, registry, square bracket, whatever name you want to give it, semicolon, I think it's value. And then it's just name and value. It's key value pairs, basically name and value. And then that value property is going to get probably something like 1.2 as a string, or however that registry key is expecting to behave. So you now, like, we don't do compilation on the machine at all. It's always a precompiled MOF file that goes in that zip file, but you can overwrite the properties of that MOF file on the fly as it's delivered by Azure. So that's pretty neat. Sequence of events. The major change here is that we programmatically call get. Windows PowerShell get was completely something that was run manually. Like, you want to get the current state of the machine, you could run the get method. You could run the command that triggers the get method, and then it would return a hash table about the current status. And so otherwise, the way that the flow previously happened was test runs. If the machine's compliant, great, nothing to do. If it's not compliant, run set to make it compliant, right? The major change here is both for audit and set. The machine is going to finish by running get, and that will collect the current state of the machine. All of that information is what you see in the portal when you go look at the current state. So if it says something like expected 1, actual 0, and then it shows as not compliant, it's because it was looking for 1, but it found 0. And you can now see what the current state of the machine is as part of the report. So we do have special requirements for get, although this is technically optional. So there's a like a catch-all scenario in the service where if this is not implemented, then it will just take the results from get and say the input was this list of properties. What we actually found from get was this list of properties. But you can make a really nice user experience by enhancing the get method in your custom resources. And that's all documented here. Basically, you just create an embedded class. And so it has code and phrase. Whatever you put in phrase is what's going to show up in the portal. And the reason that's an embedded class, or I guess the reason that you would want to think about this in a special way, is that code phrase pair becomes an item in an array. And that's because you could have multiple reasons why an individual check is not compliant. You can throw each of those into an array, return that as the reasons property of the get hash table, and then that's what will show up in the portal. There's examples here of how to do that in your schema.mof. This all happens for you. I guess whenever you're authoring your resources, you need to keep this in mind if you want to make it pretty, and then that resource is going to end up in the package for you as the modules being authored. If you're using class-based resources, then here's the example of how to embed that class, and then the reasons class gets called here as a property of that DSC resource. Configuration names. General rule of thumb, just use the same name everywhere. So the name of your configuration, the name of the MOF, the name of the zip, the name of the configuration that's being assigned, the name of the assignment, just use the same name everywhere. It's easier whenever you're trying to track down things and do troubleshooting. There are some cases where, like, you could have a different configuration name than your configuration assignment, and that will actually cause an error inside the machine because it'll say, I can't find this thing. So just general rule of thumb, use the same name everywhere. The module does handle some of this for you. So like if you compiled to localhost.mof, when the package is generated, it will make sure that the mof file name matches the configuration name and that the package name matches the configuration name. But just general rule of thumb, just use the same name everywhere. And then this is kind of important. So what hasn't been implemented yet? The major two things that I would consider to be very common in the world of DSC that we're still working on: we don't yet support wait for. Wait for is used whenever you're trying to manage configurations across multiple machines. So it's like, I want to build a domain controller, and then I want the other machine to wait for that domain to be created, and then it can join the domain. So it's kind of like cross-machine orchestration. We haven't implemented that yet. And then, in my opinion, the bigger one is handling reboots, where you can set properties inside the configuration to make sure the machine is properly rebooted after the end of the run, things like that. Hasn't been implemented yet. So I say yet, it's on the backlog. I fully understand that it's an important scenario. It just didn't make the cut for public preview. So those are the two big things. And then finally, you can run guest configuration and Windows PowerShell DSC side by side. I wouldn't necessarily say that I recommend that, but technically there is no blocker. The reason I don't recommend it is, again, no conflict detection. If you took the same configuration with different properties and assigned it one through Windows PowerShell and the other through guest config, it's just going to flap back and forth every 15 minutes for each agent. So again, they just don't know about each other. There's no there's nothing between them that overlaps in any way. So they're just completely independent. They can work side by side. I think the only reason that I have come across so far to consider running them side by side is like a migration scenario where you're introducing guest config and you're working towards moving over configurations from Windows PowerShell DSC. And in that case, you might have a little period of overlap, and that won't break anything. But long term, I would just move towards the newer version. And finally, we end with where to go from here. So if you haven't, definitely read the guest configuration overview. And then if you're reading this, you're probably interested in creating custom content. So I would go directly to the page where you start setting up your development environment and then on to creating the package. Thanks.